A look at Genesis chapter 12 and verses 10 to 20, which I'm calling Sister Act 1. You might recall that highly successful movie Sister Act, in which Whoopi Goldberg starred as Dolores, and with her life in great danger, Dolores is forced to change her identity. And in our passage we're presented with another Sister Act. Abram, fearing that his own life is in great danger, changes his and Sarah's public identity, no longer presenting themselves as husband and wife, but as brother and sister. Now, what do you think about this as a summary of our passage? God has brought Abram into the promised land. He now tests Abram's faith by causing famine. And instead of trusting God to provide for him, Abram decides to go down to Egypt. And to save his own skin, he places his wife in great danger by deceitfully having her present herself as his sister instead of his wife. And Pharaoh, being none the wiser, admiring Sarah's great beauty, takes her to be his own wife. And then God intervenes to rescue Sarah by bringing disease on Pharaoh and his household, leading Pharaoh to discover Sarah's true identity. And Abram's deplorable and shameful actions are highlighted all the more when Pharaoh reprimands him for his actions. And if it wasn't for God's grace, Abram would well and truly have stuffed everything up. And as it is, God is so gracious that Abram actually ends up even richer than before. Now, does that accurately sum up this passage? Well, no, it most certainly does not. The summary I've just given is a pretty standard Western understanding of this event, and it's radically wrong. And we need to take a fresh look at what is really going on in this fascinating story. And to that end, notice 4 things about this passage. First of all, that God's promises are under threat. Secondly, the problem of fear. Thirdly, the presumption of Pharaoh. And fourthly, the providence of God. Now, first of all, do note that God's promises are under threat. Just so happened that last year, in June, hundreds of residents had to evacuate a 10-year-old high-rise unit block in a suburb of Sydney called Mascot after cracks were found in the building. And that was after the similar debacle involving Opal Tower in Sydney's Olympic Park. So just imagine the plight of those who bought units believing in the promise that they were good value for money. Now, Abram has begun to take occupancy of the land promised to him by God, and now the cracks are starting to appear. There's a famine in the land, and so now Abram not only has a barren wife, but he's living in a barren land. And he's in the far south of Canaan, the Negev, not that far from Egypt. And remember, Abram is responsible for maybe 2,000 people under his leadership, plus thousands of sheep, cattle and donkeys. Now, Abram has not been told to stay in the land. God caused this famine precisely because, like Jacob and his family later, he wants to force Abram to enter Egypt, where the mighty river Nile ensures there'll be plenty of fodder and provisions for his livestock and servants. Later readers would certainly connect this up with Jacob's experience later on. Now, in the preceding passage, we've learned that Abram is the new Adam, the new Noah, and God brought blessing back into the world through Noah, and he'd do the same again through Abraham on a much more massive scale. And like Noah, after the flood, Abraham builds altars, and when Abraham enters Egypt, he's effectively stepping back into the same fallen world in which Noah lived, as described in Genesis chapter 6 and verses 1 and 2. It's a world full of violence, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Now, scholars debate whether the sons of God are those from the line of Shem, or whether they were angelic beings, or whether they were kings. But whatever the right interpretation, this expression of human evil prepares us for what we read in our passage. For the rulers of Egypt, the pharaohs, were regarded as being the sons of God, sons of the sun god Re. And there's an ancient Jewish understanding of Genesis 6, 1 to 2, which recognises that some ancient kings, like the pharaohs, were effectively called sons of God, and see such kings lusting after beautiful women like Sarai, and forcibly taking them and adding them to their harem. Now, nobody could stop powerful kings from doing this. But whatever the precise identity of the sons of God in Genesis 6, it remains the case that Pharaoh, as a son of God, saw beautiful women and he married any of them he wanted to. And God has forced Abram to enter this world. He had been promised a great name, a great nation and land, and now he's entering what the ancient world considered to be a great nation and a great land, with the ruler possessing a great name as the son of Re, the son of God. So he's entering the most recent reboot, as it were, of Babel. And one day, of course, we know Abram's great name and great nation will far exceed in glory anything ancient Egypt ever attained. But at this point in history, Abram's life, by comparison, looks pretty pathetic. In Canaan, Abram is a big fish in a small pond. He's a wealthy and powerful man, but Egypt is one of the great superpowers of his day. Donald Trump keeps saying that he wants to make America great again, and one witness said that the way to make America great is by banning pre-shredded cheese. Now, God has promised to give Abram a great name and to make him a great nation, and this actually involves a process of shedding, not shredding. So when Abram enters Egypt, he becomes a very small fish in a massive wild ocean. So Abram is like a man in the ocean, conscious of the presence of a killer shark nearby. And indeed, he was like a small fish swimming in the ocean, threatened by the greatest predator of them all, the great white shark, the Pharaoh. Now God not only promised Abram a great name and great nation, but also the land around Shechem for his offspring. And if God doesn't keep Abram alive, then all these promises will be broken. And unlike us, Abram doesn't have a Bible. In the ancient world, all the gods were territorial gods. And places like Ur and Iran, they worshipped deities associated with the moon god. In Canaan, people worshipped deities associated with Baal. In Egypt, there were yet other gods. And as the book of Exodus makes clear, the gods of Egypt were considered to be particularly powerful. So Abraham must have understood, because he's still working out who God is. He must have wondered whether God was able to protect him while he was in Egypt. I mean, does God's power reach there? And as we've already learned, the very development of Abraham's faith and character hinges on God deliberately giving Abraham little idea of what is really going on. Abram doesn't even know that God's plan is to give him children through Sarai. Well, we need to look at the second thing then now, the problem of fear. Because as Abram enters Egypt, he feels deeply afraid. I mean, he's married to an exceptionally beautiful woman. There was a little girl who watched in fascination as her mother smoothed cold cream on her face, and she said, "Mum, why do you do that?" And she said, "To make myself beautiful." And then, as she began to remove the cream with a tissue, the little girl piped up, "Mum, what are you doing? Are you giving up?" And Phyllis Diller quipped, "I will never give up. I'm in my 14th year of a 10-day beauty plan." And she also advised, no matter what you look like, marry a man your own age. Then as your beauty fades, so will his eyesight. Now we can joke about female beauty, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with being beautiful. When beautiful women are only valued for their physical beauty, then it is very easy for women to develop a low self-image, to think the only thing that gives a woman value is her being beautiful. And for the woman who feels unloved, Casey Chambers sings, "Am I not pretty enough?" And in Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby, we hear the magnificent voice of Lana Del Rey asking, "Will you still love me when I'm no longer young and beautiful?" Tragically, over the centuries, Western painters and theologians have often associated female beauty with sexual temptation. And Christian women can easily get the idea or message from men that to display their beauty to the world is a sin, and that if they do so, they're asking for beauty. Now, Abram is very scared. And he's got good reason to be, because Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And we know that Sarai has immense value in the eyes of God as a person. But in Egypt, Abram and Sarai find themselves in a world where those with the power to take whatever they want will treat Sarai as though the only thing that gives her value is her physical beauty. Now, lifespans in Abram's time were much longer than they are today. So Sarai, then about maybe 65, would have been the equivalent of a very beautiful 30-year-old or possibly 40-year-old woman. She was gorgeous, and the Pharaoh had no doubt told his officials to identify any beautiful women so that he could add them to his harem. He couldn't care two hoots about their character, any inner beauty they might have. Sarai is identified as extremely beautiful, and that alone makes her worth adding to the Pharaoh's trophy case. Now, last year I was informed of a 15-year-old Christian girl in Pakistan who was kidnapped, sold, and given in marriage to a Muslim man after being forced to convert to Islam. And there are many thousands of Christians in Pakistan, Christian girls in Pakistan, who've suffered the same fate. And in the vast majority of cases, the police and the law courts simply accept that the girl is now a Muslim. And Christians are utterly incapable of doing anything whatsoever to change this terrible situation. When God forced Abram into Egypt, he reduced Abram down to a state of utter powerlessness. Abram was completely incapable of defending himself and his wife. That's where God wants him to be. And if the Pharaoh decided to take Sarah, there wasn't a jolly thing Abram could do to stop him from doing so. I don't know whether life circumstances have put you in a position of utter helplessness. Does it seem that you're on your own? If you're honest, is there a part of your life that seems to be beyond God's reach? From the outsider's perspective, it looked like Jesus was just another frail human being caught up in the merciless political game playing that went on between Rome and the Jewish authorities. Now, at one critical point, Pilate asked Jesus, "Don't you realise I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And like Pharaoh, Pilate presumes the power of life and death is in his hands. And you might remember Jesus' reply, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." And Abraham needed to learn that Pharaoh, for all his self-exaltation and divine pretensions, did not have ultimate power over him. God will fulfill his purpose to bless all the families of the earth through Abraham, through our Lord Jesus, and now through you and me, and there is nothing that all the pharaohs of this world can do to prevent this. So never forget that for all your own sense of powerlessness, your life is in the hands of the one who holds all power and who is committed to bless you and make your life a blessing for others. Every culture has sins that they regard as especially bad. In modern secular culture, one of the great sins is intolerance, the refusal to accept any kind of diversity, other than adherence to Christian faith. And in many cultures, anger is one of the most serious of sins, whether or so it is in our culture. In the ancient world, curiously enough, adultery was regarded as being a particularly heinous sin. And given this, even the Pharaoh would not want to be seen as committing adultery. And later King David, explicitly called the Son of God, sees a beautiful woman, Uriah's wife, and takes her. And he does this secretly. And in the end, because adultery is not an option, he arranges for Uriah to be killed. And he apparently does this without any qualms of conscience until God confronts him through Nathan the prophet. And as Abram fully appreciates, if the Pharaoh wants to take Sarai as his wife and he sees that she's already married, then he has an easy way of avoiding the sin of committing adultery. All he has to do is to kill the husband. And that's the evil, corrupt and fallen world in which Abram now finds himself, and he knows it. So, Abram resorts to a very clever ruse, something with which Sarai, honouring her husband, fully agrees. In 1 Peter 3, 5-6 we read, "For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear." Now Peter possibly penned these words with this passage in mind. I don't know, but it's just a guess. Anyway, Abram and Sarai decide to present themselves not as husband and wife, but as brother and sister, a strategy they often use. It crops up again in chapter 20, being emulated also by Isaac and Rebekah later on. And the strategy goes like this. If Abram is thought to be her brother, then if the Pharaoh or some other powerful person wanted to take Sarai as his wife, then normally, given the absence of Sarai's father, there would be a process of negotiation with the head of the family, that is, her brother. Now it so happens that Sarai was in fact Abram's half-sister. And later Abram tells King Abimelech, "Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife." That's chapter 20 and verse 12. And understandably, we find this very disturbing on two levels. First of all, Abraham still needs to learn that he can fully trust God to protect him and his wife without resorting to such a deceitful ruse. And also, we are disturbed by the fact that Abraham's marriage is an example of incest, later explicitly outlawed in God's law to Israel through Moses. Now, in Abram's day, endogamy, marrying within one's own kin, was not regarded in the same way as it was just a few centuries later. So it's not being condoned. God did not choose Abram and Sarah because they were perfect human beings. They were deeply flawed people just like you and me. It's just the way it is. Now we come to look at the presumption of Pharaoh. Abram's plan, for all its guile and cleverness, it backfired. Pharaoh, through his officials, simply saw Sarah and took her. There were no negotiations, though after the event Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maid servants, and camels to add to all the other stuff he already had. But don't take hold of the wrong end of the stick. Look carefully at the use of language in this passage. Don't think that Abram was the cowardly, deceitful, bad guy, and Pharaoh the relatively innocent party who has every right to castigate Abram. There's language used here which echoes Genesis chapter 3. Notice that the Egyptians saw Sarai was ravishingly beautiful, and Pharaoh's officials also saw her beauty, and she was taken. Remember the fall? The woman saw that the fruit was good to eat, and she took it. We live in a world which began with two people deciding for themselves, independent of God, what they would consider to be good and bad, and what they would consider to be right and wrong. But the irony is that in reality, it is usually the screwed up morality of the pharaohs of this world, those in positions of great power, which carries the day. Now, all ancient readers knew that Pharaoh was thought of as the Son of God, as a God himself. And when Pharaoh reproaches Abram, he does so as one who puts himself in the place of God. His opening words, "What have you done?" actually deliberately recalls God's words to Eve. Very similar. And when Pharaoh asks Abram, "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" we already know the answer. Abram's words to his wife were right on the money, weren't they? "They will kill me." So don't feel any sympathy for Pharaoh. Abram had good reason to think that he would have signed his own death warrant if he had told Pharaoh from the outset that Sarai was his wife, even though he did need to learn to trust God. Notably, the presumption of Pharaoh is also expressed in the way the story ends. And when Pharaoh expels Abram from Egypt, the same verb is used not merely at the time of the Exodus. It's also the same verb that's used to describe God expelling Adam from the Garden of Eden. So Pharaoh acts like God, even in the way he ends up treating Abram and his wife. And now we look at the providence of God. Let's remind ourselves of the predicament that Abram found himself in. If he had protested, he would simply have been killed, or that's what he thought would happen. He was a foreigner with no civil rights and no protection. He was completely and utterly helpless. But God came to the rescue, intervening by inflicting diseases on Pharaoh's household. And in the ancient world, and in many cultures today, it would automatically be assumed that diseases have spiritual causes and are not just due to viruses or bacteria or fungi and parasites. God made sure that they would work out the real cause of the situation. Obviously, Pharaoh did not think that Abram himself had brought the plagues on him and his household. But the reason why Pharaoh doesn't kill Abram and even sends him off with great wealth is precisely because he knows Abram is backed by considerable divine power. And Pharaoh does not want to offend this deity any further. And indeed he hopes by blessing Abraham to appease him. By this stage in the story, you may have realised that what we're reading here is remarkably similar to what happens later in Egypt. The powerlessness of Abram in Egypt parallels the utter impotence of the enslaved people of Israel in Egypt under another Pharaoh. The threat to Abram's life threatens the fulfilment of God's promise. And in Exodus 1, this other Pharaoh poses a similar threat in seeking to kill all male Hebrew babies. Just as the beautiful person Sarai is brought into Pharaoh's place, so too in Exodus 2, a beautiful baby, Moses, is brought into Pharaoh's household. In judgment, God brings plagues upon Egypt in Moses' day, just as he does in our story. And just as Pharaoh ends up expelling Israel from the land, so too the Pharaoh in our passage expels Abram from the land. The same verbs used. And also remember that despite all of this, Israel left Egypt greatly enriched, just as Abram does. Lots of parallels here, aren't there? It's a wonderful thing to be God's people. God is committed to using his church, the great nation of today, to bring his blessing to all families on the face of the earth. And God's use of us is not dependent upon our ability to come up with clever strategies to deal with challenges and threats. It's not dependent upon us being in control. Life circumstances sometimes force us into situations we'd rather avoid, both as individuals and as churches. We need to identify those things in our lives and in the life of our church that are beyond our control. And when we've done that, we need to throw ourselves upon God's goodness and grace, remembering that God's power is made perfect in our weakness.